Power is a dangerous drug, especially in the hands of a man who believes a piece of metal on his chest grants him absolute authority over anyone he deems beneath him. When Officer Bradley Smith spotted a black man driving a pristine, late-model luxury sedan through a wealthy, quiet suburb, his prejudiced instincts immediately took the wheel. He didn't see a citizen going about his day. He saw a target, an anomaly that offended his narrow worldview, and an opportunity to exert his dominance. What Smith's blinding arrogance prevented him from seeing, however, was the catastrophic error he was about to make. He didn't just pull over a civilian that sunny afternoon. He slapped handcuffs on the Honorable Clement Pendleton, the Chief Administrative Judge of the State Superior Court. This is the story of a routine traffic stop that dismantled a corrupt cop's life in under an hour. Clement Pendleton loved Saturday mornings. After a grueling week presiding over a docket filled with high-stakes corporate litigation, brutal criminal sentencings, and the exhausting bureaucracy of the state judicial system, his weekend routine was his sanctuary. At 58, Clement was a man who commanded a courtroom with a quiet, terrifyingly sharp intellect. But on weekends, he was just a man who loved his garden. On this particular Saturday in late October, Clement had traded his tailored charcoal robes and silk ties for a faded university sweatshirt, worn-in denim jeans, and a pair of scuffed leather work boots. His wife, Claire, had asked him to pick up some specialty mulch and a few terracotta pots from a high-end nursery located 2 towns over in the affluent, predominantly white suburb of Oak Creek. Clement didn't mind the drive. He took his personal vehicle, a spotless midnight blue BMW 7 Series, a gift to himself after 30 years of impeccable legal service. The autumn leaves were a brilliant canopy of gold and crimson as Clement cruised at exactly 3 miles under the speed limit down Elmwood Drive, a sprawling avenue flanked by gated estates. He was listening to a jazz record, his mind miles away from the gavel and the bench. A few blocks behind him, sitting idling in a marked cruiser tucked behind a stone decorative wall, was Officer Bradley Smith. Smith was 32, sporting a tight military buzz cut and an attitude that had earned him 4 excessive force complaints in the last 3 years, all quietly swept under the rug by a police union that protected its own. Smith viewed the town of Oak Creek not as a community to serve, but as his personal kingdom to police. He possessed a deeply ingrained, toxic worldview that categorized people the moment he laid eyes on them. When the midnight blue BMW rolled past his hiding spot, Smith's eyes narrowed. The car was expensive. Too expensive. And through the driver's side window, Smith caught a clear glimpse of Clement, an older black man, dressed down, driving a $100,000 car in a neighborhood where the median home price was over $2 million. To Smith, the math didn't add up. His bias immediately wrote a narrative. Stolen car, drug money, or someone who simply doesn't belong here. Smith slammed the cruiser into drive, tires squealing slightly against the pavement, and pulled out onto Elmwood Drive. He didn't have probable cause. He didn't have reasonable suspicion. He had a hunch fueled entirely by a racist stereotype. He aggressively accelerated, closing the gap between the cruiser and the BMW in a matter of seconds, tailgating Clement perilously close to run the plates. In the rearview mirror, Clement noticed the aggressive approach. His brow furrowed. He checked his speedometer. 32 in a 35 zone. He checked his mirrors. He was perfectly centered in his lane. He had come to a complete stop at the previous sign. A familiar, cold knot formed in his stomach. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in decades, not since he was a young public defender driving a beat-up sedan. But it was a feeling every black man in America knows intimately. The plates came back clean, registered to an Clement Pendleton. No warrants, no flags. For a good officer, This would be the end of it. The car belonged to the driver, but for Bradley Smith, the clean plate was just an annoyance. His ego was already engaged. He wanted to look inside the car. He wanted to exert his authority. He wanted to put this man in his place. Smith flicked the switch. The light bar exploded into a chaotic strobe of red and blue, and the siren let out a sharp, piercing wail. Clement sighed, a deep, heavy sound that filled the quiet cabin of his car. He signaled right, smoothly pulling the heavy BMW onto the wide shoulder of the road, putting the vehicle in park, turning off the engine and rolling all 4 windows down, a habit he had taught his own son years ago. He placed both hands firmly at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Waiting, Smith approached the vehicle with a swagger that bordered on theatrical. His right hand rested casually, yet deliberately, on the butt of his sidearm. He stopped just behind the B-pillar of the BMW, forcing Clement to turn his head uncomfortably to look back at him. It was a standard tactical move, but Smith executed it with a sneer. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Smith barked, bypassing any form of standard greeting. No, "Good morning," no, "Sir." Just a demand. "Officer," Clement said, his voice a rich, calm baritone. "My license is in my wallet, in my back right pocket. My registration and insurance are in the glove compartment. How would you like me to proceed?" Smith's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to citizens speaking to him with such measured, unbothered precision. He wanted deference. He wanted fear. He perceived Clement's calm articulation as defiance. "Just get the documents," Smith snapped, shining his heavy tactical flashlight directly into Clement's eyes, despite it being 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Clement winced slightly, turning his head away from the blinding beam. Moving slowly and deliberately, he reached across to the glove compartment, retrieved the paperwork, and then leaned forward slightly to extract his wallet. He handed the cards out the window. Smith snatched them. He looked at the license, Clement Pendleton. He looked at the registration. The name matched. "Whose car is this?" Smith asked, his tone laced with condescension. "It is my car, officer," Clement replied smoothly, keeping his hands on the wheel. "As the registration indicates." "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Clement's eyes hardened, just a fraction. This was the line. As a judge, he spent his life upholding the law, analyzing constitutional rights, and dissecting the nuances of the Fourth Amendment. He knew precisely what Smith was doing. It was an unlawful fishing expedition. "I'm running errands, officer," Clement said. "Now, if you don't mind, could you please tell me why I was pulled over? Was I speeding?" "You swerved," Smith lied without missing a beat. "Failure to maintain your lane. Smells like you might have been drinking. Have you had anything to drink today, Clement?" Smith deliberately used the first name, stripping away the formality. A classic power play designed to demean. "I have not had a drop of alcohol, officer, and I did not swerve. My vehicle is equipped with lane-keeping assist, and I assure you, I was maintaining my lane perfectly." Clement's tone shifted. The casual weekend gardener was gone. The chief judge was beginning to surface. "Again, I ask for the legal justification for this stop." "Don't get smart with me, boy," Smith hissed, leaning closer to the window. The slur hung in the crisp autumn air, heavy and violent. Clement froze. Boy. The word echoed in his mind. He had been a federal prosecutor, a defense attorney, and a respected jurist. He had put away mob bosses and corrupt politicians. And here, on a beautiful Saturday, a mediocre man with a badge was calling him boy. In that split second, Clement Pendleton made a highly calculated, immensely disciplined decision. Most men in his position of power would have dropped their title immediately. They would have yelled, "Do you know who I am?" They would have demanded a supervisor. But Clement looked at the aggressive, twitchy officer, and he saw a menace to society. If Smith was treating him this way, a man in a luxury car in broad daylight, what was he doing to young teenagers at night? What was he doing to people who didn't know their rights? Clement decided not to play the judge card. Not yet. He decided to let Bradley Smith construct his own gallows, plank by plank, nail by nail. "I am not getting smart, officer," Clement said quietly. "I am simply asking questions within my rights." "Step out of the vehicle," Smith ordered, taking a half step back and unfastening the retention strap on his holster. "Under what authority?" Clement asked, though he knew the precedent of Pennsylvania versus Mims allowed officers to order drivers out of vehicles. He just wanted Smith to verbally trip over his own lack of probable cause. "Because I told you to. Step out of the car right now, or I will drag you out." Clement slowly unbuckled his seatbelt. He opened the door and stepped out onto the asphalt. He was an inch taller than Smith, though Smith carried more bulk. "Turn around and put your hands on the roof of the car," Smith ordered. "Am I being detained?" Clement asked. "You're about to be arrested for resisting," Smith spat, grabbing Clement roughly by the shoulder and spinning him around, slamming him unnecessarily hard against the side of the BMW. The cold metal of handcuffs bit sharply into Clement's wrists. Smith wrenched Clement's arms up high behind his back, a pain compliance technique entirely unwarranted for a compliant suspect. Clement let out a sharp gasp of breath, but kept his mouth shut. Let him hang himself, Clement thought, memorizing the badge number gleaming on Smith's chest. 7492. "You people always think you can talk your way out of things," Smith muttered as he tightened the cuffs down to the bone. "Not in my town." The ride to the Oak Creek precinct took 12 minutes. For Clement, crammed into the hard plastic back seat of the cruiser with his arms agonizingly pinned behind him, it felt like an hour. He used the time to mentally draft the exact civil rights violations, battery charges, and departmental policy breaches Smith was committing. It was a long list. Smith, meanwhile, was riding high. In the front seat, he casually chatted on his police radio, sounding upbeat. He felt victorious. He had exerted his power, silenced a man who dared to question him, and secured an arrest. He didn't even know what he was going to charge him with yet. Probably disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and maybe a vague, obstructing a peace officer charge. The charges didn't matter. The punishment was the ride. The cruiser pulled into the secured bay of the precinct. Smith hauled Clement out of the back seat by the chain of the handcuffs, causing Clement to stumble slightly. "Keep moving," Smith ordered, marching his prisoner through the heavy metal doors and into the chaotic, fluorescent-lit bullpen of the station. The Oak Creek precinct was moderately busy. Officers were typing at desks, a few civilians were at the front counter filing reports, and the shift supervisor, Sergeant Thomas Riley, was at the high booking desk, sorting through a stack of paperwork. Smith paraded Clement through the center of the room, wanting everyone to see his prize. He walked Clement right up to the booking desk. "Got a live one, Sarge," Smith announced loudly, a smug grin plastered across his face. "Combative, refusing lawful orders, suspected DUI, though he claims he's sober. Driving a stolen-looking Beamer out on Elmwood." Sergeant Riley, a 20-year veteran with a graying mustache and tired eyes, didn't immediately look up. "Name?" he grumbled, pulling a blank booking sheet toward him. "Claims it's Clement Pendleton. Haven't run his prints yet to see who he really is," Smith sneered. At the sound of the name, Riley's pen stopped. He froze. Slowly, almost mechanically, Sergeant Riley raised his head and looked at the man in handcuffs. Clement stood tall, despite the awkward angle of his pinned arms. He looked directly at the sergeant. His expression was not one of fear or even anger, but of cold, absolute judgment. Riley's mouth opened slightly. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him a sickly shade of grey. He recognized the man immediately. Not only had Judge Pendleton sworn Riley in as a sergeant 5 years ago, but Riley had testified in Pendleton's courtroom just 3 weeks prior on a major burglary ring case. "Oh, sweet, merciful God," Riley whispered, the paperwork slipping from his trembling fingers to the floor. Smith, oblivious to the atmosphere instantly shifting in the room, chuckled. Yeah, he was a real piece of work on the side of the road. Tried to get legal with me. Sergeant Riley bolted up from his chair. He didn't speak to Smith. He practically sprinted around the booking counter, his hands reaching for the handcuff keys on his belt. "Judge Pendleton," Riley stammered, his hands shaking so badly he struggled to get the key into the tiny keyhole. "Your Honor, I am so incredibly sorry. Sir, are you hurt?" The word hit the bustling precinct like a stun grenade. "Judge, Your Honor." The typing stopped. The phones seemed to stop ringing. Every officer in the bullpen slowly turned their heads to stare at the booking desk. Smith stood frozen, his smug smile slowly sliding off his face, replaced by a mask of profound, uncomprehending confusion. "Sarge? What are you doing? He's my collar." Riley finally got the cuffs off. Clement rubbed his raw red wrists, bringing his arms forward. He rolled his shoulders, wincing slightly. He looked at Riley, then slowly turned his gaze to Smith. "Sarge?" Smith repeated, his voice suddenly smaller. "What did you call him?" Before Riley could answer, the door to the captain's office swung open. Captain Richard Hayes, the precinct commander, stepped out, holding a coffee mug. He had heard the sudden silence in the bullpen and came to investigate. Hayes looked at the scene. He saw Sergeant Riley looking like he was about to be executed. He saw Smith looking confused. And then he saw the man rubbing his wrists. Captain Hayes dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on the linoleum floor, hot coffee splashing everywhere. But Hayes didn't even blink. "Judge Pendleton," Captain Hayes said, his voice dropping an octave, hollow with dread. "Good afternoon, Captain Hayes," Clement said calmly, his voice ringing out in the dead silent room. "It seems one of your officers has a rather unique interpretation of the Fourth Amendment, and of my right to drive down Elmwood Drive without being called a boy." Smith felt the floor beneath him turn to liquid, his breath caught in his throat. He looked at the man he had just physically assaulted, illegally detained, and racially abused. He hadn't arrested a criminal. He had arrested the chief administrative judge, the man who signed the precinct's warrants, the man who decided the fate of their biggest cases, the man who had the power to summon the Department of Justice with a single phone call. "Smith," Captain Hayes said, his voice trembling with a terrifying, suppressed rage as he slowly walked toward the officer. "Give me your badge. Give me your gun. Right now." The sound of Captain Richard Hayes's coffee mug shattering against the precinct's linoleum floor seemed to echo for an eternity. The hot liquid splashed over the polished black shoes of Sergeant Thomas Riley, but neither man moved to wipe it away. The air in the bullpen had grown incredibly thin, as if the oxygen had been violently sucked out through the ventilation shafts. Bradley Smith stood frozen. The smug, triumphant sneer that had plastered his face just moments before was now sliding off, replaced by a slack-jawed mask of profound, uncomprehending terror. He looked from Captain Hayes, whose face was completely devoid of color, to Sergeant Riley, who looked as though he might physically be ill, and finally to the tall, dignified black man standing calmly in front of the booking desk. "Captain," Smith stammered, his voice cracking, entirely losing the aggressive baritone he used on the streets. "Captain, I caught him swerving. He was combative. I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Captain Hayes's voice was a terrifying, barely audible whisper. He took a slow, deliberate step toward Smith. "Your job is to enforce the law, Smith, not to invent it. Give me your badge. Give me your weapon. Right now." "Sir, the Union." "If you mention the Union right now, I will lock you in a holding cell myself." Hayes cut him off, the suppressed rage finally bubbling over into a sharp bark that made several junior officers flinch. "You are stripped of your police powers, pending a full internal and external investigation. Disarm yourself. Now." Smith's hands trembled violently as he reached for the brass star on his chest. It took him 3 attempts to undo the pin, his fingers numb and uncoordinated. He placed the badge on the booking desk. The soft clink of the metal against the wood felt like a gavel striking a sound block. He unbuckled his heavy leather duty belt, the weight of his Glock 19, his taser, and his extra magazines hitting the counter with a heavy thud. In less than 60 seconds, Bradley Smith had been reduced from a heavily armed enforcer to a civilian in a cheap polyester uniform. "Go sit in my office and close the door," Hayes ordered, refusing to even look at Smith. "Do not speak to anyone. Do not touch your phone." As Smith practically scuttled away, looking small and intensely vulnerable, Captain Hayes turned his attention to Clement. The captain's demeanor shifted from wrathful commander to desperate damage control. He approached Clement with his hands raised slightly, a placating gesture. "Judge Pendleton," Hayes began, his voice thick with a sickeningly sweet tone of apology. "I cannot express how deeply, profoundly sorry I am for this appalling misunderstanding. This is not how the Oak Creek Police Department operates. It's an aberration. Please let me get you a coffee. Let me have Sergeant Riley drive you back to your vehicle personally. We will expunge any record of you being brought in here. It will be like it never happened." Clement had been rubbing the raw, red indentations on his wrists where the steel cuffs had bitten into his skin. He stopped. He looked at Captain Hayes, his dark eyes radiating an icy, calculating intelligence. He recognized the maneuver instantly. The aberration defense. The sweep-it-under-the-rug tactic. If Clement walked out that door now, Smith would get a slap on the wrist, a few days of paid administrative leave, and he would be back on the streets hunting for his next victim within a month. Clement Pendleton was not a man who allowed bullies to hide in the shadows. "Captain Hayes," Clement said, his voice carrying clearly across the dead-silent bullpen. "You will do no such thing." Hayes blinked, confused. "Your Honor? You are not going to unarrest me, Captain. And you are certainly not going to expunge the record," Clement instructed, his tone bearing the absolute authority of the bench. "Officer Smith explicitly stated I was being arrested for resisting, and he brought me into a secure law enforcement facility in handcuffs. I am formally in your custody. I want you to complete the booking process. I want a case number generated. I want a mug shot taken. I want my fingerprints recorded in your system." Sergeant Riley let out a quiet groan. He knew exactly what the judge was doing. "Judge, please," Hayes begged, sweat beading on his forehead. "If we formalize this booking, it generates a paper trail. It goes into the state system. It will be a logistical nightmare to undo." "That is precisely the point," Clement replied, unwavering. "I am a citizen who was subjected to an unlawful stop, an illegal detention, excessive force, and racial slurs by an officer acting under the color of law. If you erase this, you erase his crime. You will generate a permanent, unassailable public record of this false arrest. If you refuse, I will add obstruction of justice and destruction of evidence to the federal civil rights lawsuit I am drafting in my head." Hayes realized he was cornered. He was dealing with a legal titan who knew the system better than the entire precinct combined. Sergeant, Hayes swallowed hard, his throat dry. Process the judge. But for God's sake, don't put him in a cell. Use the interview room. There is one more thing, Captain, Clement said, taking a step closer to Hayes. The air grew tense again. Officer Smith, body-worn camera. I want it secured. I want the dash cam footage from his cruiser secured. I want the precinct's IT director to pull the server logs proving those files have not been accessed, edited, or deleted. I want a time-stamped copy of all audio and video burned to a physical drive, and I want it handed to me before I leave this building. Your Honor, standard protocol dictates that body cam footage requires a subpoena. Captain Hayes, Clement interrupted, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. Do not quote standard protocol to the man who literally wrote the state guidelines on digital evidence admissibility. You will secure that footage right now, or my next phone call is to the special agent in charge of the FBI's regional field office to report a civil rights violation in progress. Do we have an understanding? Yes, Your Honor. Right away. Hayes surrendered completely. He turned to a pale-faced lieutenant standing nearby. You heard him. Lock down the servers. Pull Smith camera. Now. For the next 2 hours, the chief administrative judge of the Superior Court sat in a sterile interview room, politely but firmly demanding that the Oak Creek Police Department document their own catastrophic liability, page by agonizing page. Clement Pendleton finally arrived home just as the late afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across his manicured lawn. His midnight blue BMW, retrieved by a terrified Sergeant Riley and driven back to Clement's driveway, sat gleaming in the fading light. When Clement walked through the front door, the heavy oak clicking shut behind him. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the ordeal finally began to ebb. He took off his jacket and rolled up his sleeves. His wrists were bruised, a dark, ugly purple ring wrapping around his forearms. His wife, Claire, walked into the hallway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. A prominent pediatrician with a sharp eye, she immediately noticed the bruising and the subtle tension in her husband's jaw. "Clement?" she asked, her voice tight with instant concern. "What happened? Where are the gardening supplies?" Clement let out a long, exhausted breath. He walked over, kissed her forehead, and led her into the living room. "Sit down, Claire. We need to talk. And then I need to make some phone calls." By 8 a.m. on Monday morning, the town of Oak Creek was sitting on a legal and political fault line, and the tectonic plates were about to violently shift. In the district attorney's office, located in the county seat 30 miles away, absolute chaos reigned. District Attorney Robert Sterling, an ambitious politician who usually loved high-profile cases, was currently holding his head in his hands, staring at a thick manila folder on his mahogany desk. Sitting across from him was William Harrison, the chief of police for Oak Creek, who looked as though he had aged 10 years over the weekend. "Tell me this is a joke, Bill," Sterling pleaded, his voice raspy. "Tell me your idiot patrolman didn't actually cuff Clement Pendleton. Tell me he didn't call the man who controls our entire judicial district Sterling couldn't even bring himself to say the word recorded on the audio. "It's not a joke, Bob," Chief Harrison said grimly. "I watched the body cam footage. It's clean, high definition, and utterly damning. Smith targeted him, lied about a traffic violation, escalated the situation without cause, used excessive force, and deployed a racial slur. Pendleton was fully compliant the entire time. He just let Smith dig the grave." "Why didn't Pendleton pull rank on the side of the road?" Sterling asked, baffled. Any other judge would have screamed their title out the window. "Because Pendleton isn't any other judge," Harrison replied, leaning forward. "He's a true believer in the system. He wanted to see exactly how my officers treat ordinary citizens who don't have the power to fight back, and Smith showed him. He handed Pendleton the murder weapon with his fingerprints all over it. "What's the fallout?" Sterling asked, already mentally calculating his political survival. "Pendleton didn't just file a citizen's complaint," Harrison said, tossing a massive, spiraled legal document onto the DA's desk. "At 7 a.m. today, a courier delivered this. It's a multi-tiered notice of intent to sue. He has retained Sarah Kensington." DA Sterling flinched. Sarah Kensington was a legendary civil rights attorney, a woman known for completely dismantling corrupt police departments. She didn't settle for money. She settled for federal consent decrees, mass firings, and systematic overhauls. Kensington is filing a Title 42 U.S.C. Section 1983 civil rights lawsuit against Smith personally, and against the department for failure to train and supervise, Harrison continued, his voice monotone. But that's not the worst part. How could it be worse? She has formally petitioned the Department of Justice to open a pattern and practice investigation into the Oak Creek Police Department, Harrison revealed. And she subpoenaed Smith's entire internal affairs file, the unredacted one. Sterling closed his eyes. Bradley Smith was a known liability. He had 4 prior excessive force complaints involving minorities. Every single one had been dismissed by the department's internal review board, heavily influenced by the police union. Now those buried files were going to be dragged into the unforgiving light of a federal courtroom, proving that the department knew Smith was a racist liability and actively protected him. Meanwhile, Bradley Smith was sitting in the cramped, windowless office of his police union representative, Thomas Gable. Smith was pacing like a caged animal, his arrogance replaced by a frantic, manic energy. "Tom, you gotta fix this. It's a misunderstanding. I didn't know he was a judge. He wasn't dressed like a judge. He was driving through Elmwood in a hoodie. It looked suspicious." "Brad, shut up and sit down," Gable snapped, rubbing his temples. Gable was a seasoned Union bulldog, but even he knew a lost cause when he saw one. "You don't get it. Not knowing he was a judge isn't a defense. It's the prosecution's entire point. You treated him like garbage because you thought he was a nobody. You are on tape calling a 58-year-old black man a boy." "It slipped out. I was stressed. He was being uncooperative," Smith pleaded, trying to construct a reality that didn't exist. "We can spin this. We can leak to the press that he was acting erratic. We can say he reached for something." "Did he reach for something?" Gable asked sharply. "No, but we can imply it. He was moving slow." Gable slammed his hand on the desk. "Are you insane?" Pendleton demanded the unedited body cam footage on a physical drive before he even left the precinct. "They have the tape, Brad. The DA has the tape. The chief has the tape. If you lie to the press, Sarah Kensington will wait until you make a public statement, and then she will drop the video on the 6 o'clock news and destroy you for perjury." Smith sank into a cheap plastic chair, the reality of his situation finally piercing his armor of entitlement. "So, what do? "We do damage control," Gable said grimly. "I'm going to try to negotiate a resignation in lieu of termination. You lose your pension, you lose your badge. But maybe, just maybe, I can convince DA Sterling not to press criminal charges for felony civil rights violations. If you fight this, you are going to federal prison, Brad. Do you understand me? You poked the biggest bear in the state, and it's going to eat you alive." But Thomas Gable's desperate plan for a quiet resignation was already dead on arrival. Clement Pendleton and Sarah Kensington had no intention of letting Bradley Smith quietly resign and move to another precinct a few counties over. They were going to make an example of him. By Tuesday morning, The local media had the story. It wasn't leaked. Sarah Kensington held a press conference on the steps of the federal courthouse. She didn't yell. She didn't use inflammatory rhetoric. She simply placed a large monitor on an easel, pressed play, and let the journalists watch the raw, unedited body cam footage of Officer Smith. The reporters watched the aggressive tailgating. They heard the condescending tone. They heard the lie about swerving. And then, clearly, crisply echoing from the speakers, they heard the slur. "Don't get smart with me, boy." They watched a compliant man violently slammed against a car and handcuffed for the crime of asking a question. When the video ended, the silence in the press corps was deafening. Kensington stepped to the microphone. "The man you just saw assaulted on that screen is not just a citizen. He is the Honorable Clement Pendleton, Chief Administrative Judge. He suffered this indignity, this violence, simply for existing in a neighborhood where Officer Bradley Smith decided he did not belong. If a man with Judge Pendleton's profound understanding of the law is treated this way in broad daylight, we must ask ourselves, what happens to the young men and women who do not know their rights? What happens in the dark? We are not seeking a settlement. We are seeking justice. Officer Smith has proven he is unfit to wear a badge, and the Oak Creek Police Department has proven it is unfit to police itself." The broadcast went national within the hour. Bradley Smith's career didn't just end, it imploded spectacularly, taking the dark, protected secrets of his precinct down with it. The avalanche had begun, and there was nowhere left for Smith to run. The national broadcast of the unedited body camera footage was merely the tremor. The earthquake hit the town of Oak Creek 48 hours later, fundamentally fracturing the foundation of its police department. By Thursday morning, the parking lot of the precinct was completely overrun. But it wasn't just local news vans fighting for camera angles. A fleet of dark, unmarked SUVs had formed a barricade near the rear entrance. Special Agent in Charge William Tanner of the FBI's Civil Rights Division did not call ahead to schedule an appointment with local authorities. He walked through the front double doors, flanked by 6 federal agents, bypassed the bewildered front desk sergeant entirely, and marched straight into Captain Richard Hayes's office. He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, Tanner slapped a sweeping 80-page federal warrant onto Hayes's desk. It authorized the immediate seizure of the precinct servers, the physical internal affairs filing cabinets, and all digital communications relating to Officer Bradley Smith over the past 5 years. The local political machine, which had historically protected its own to maintain the pristine, low-crime illusion of the affluent suburb, instantly cannibalized itself to survive. District Attorney Robert Sterling, a man who usually loved the slow, deliberate theater of high-profile cases, realized his own political neck was in the guillotine. If he appeared even slightly complicit in protecting a racist cop who assaulted the chief administrative judge, his career was over. Sterling convened an emergency grand jury that very afternoon. He bypassed all the usual bureaucratic delays, the standard pretrial posturing, and the backroom deals. He simply placed Judge Clement Pendleton's meticulous, sworn affidavit into the record and played the pristine, high-definition body camera footage on a large projector. He let Bradley Smith's own sneering voice do the prosecuting. The grand jury deliberated for less than 20 minutes. They handed down a true bill, indicting Bradley Smith on multiple state charges, including felony false imprisonment, official misconduct, and aggravated battery. Simultaneously, behind the closed doors of a federal courthouse in the city, the Department of Justice officially filed federal charges against Smith for deprivation of rights under color of law, violating 18 U.S.C. Section 242. For Smith, the protective walls of his reality were disintegrating at a terrifying, incomprehensible speed. He was sitting alone in the living room of his suburban townhouse, the blinds drawn tight against the afternoon sun. A half-empty bottle of cheap bourbon sat on his coffee table next to his buzzing, neglected smartphone. Every major news network was running his face on a continuous loop. When his phone finally rang with a name he recognized, Thomas Gable, his union representative, Smith snatched it up like a drowning man grabbing a life preserver. "Tom!" Smith gasped, his voice tight with panic. "Tom, you gotta tell me what the plan is. The news is saying the feds are at the precinct." There was a heavy, suffocating pause on the other end of the line. When Gable finally spoke, his voice was utterly devoid of the fraternal warmth Smith was accustomed to. "There is no plan, Brad. The Union Executive Board met an hour ago. We are officially pulling your legal defense funding." "What?" Smith felt the blood drain from his face. "You can't do that. I pay my dues. You're supposed to protect me." "We protect cops who make honest mistakes in the line of duty," Gable replied coldly. "You hunted down a superior court judge, lied on your official report, committed felony assault, and dropped a racial slur on camera. You didn't make a mistake, Brad. You executed a liability. Sarah Kensington just subpoenaed all of our internal communications regarding your past excessive force complaints. The DOJ is breathing down our necks. You are entirely on your own." The line went dead. At exactly 2 p.m., a heavy, synchronized knock echoed on Smith's front door. It wasn't the tentative tap of a delivery driver. It was the authoritative, heavy-fisted pound of law enforcement. Smith stumbled up from the couch, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, fully expecting to be blinded by the flashbulbs of the paparazzi. Instead, he found Captain Richard Hayes standing on his porch. Flanking the captain was Sergeant Thomas Riley and 2 stern-faced state troopers. Captain Hayes looked at the disheveled, hollow-eyed man who had single-handedly destroyed the reputation of his department. There was no sympathy in Hayes's eyes, no lingering camaraderie from their years on the force together. There was only a cold, bureaucratic finality. "Bradley Smith," Captain Hayes said, his voice flat and projecting into the quiet neighborhood street. "I have warrants for your arrest, issued by the state and the federal government. Step out onto the porch, turn around, and place your hands behind your back." "Cap, Richard, please," Smith whispered, his voice cracking as tears immediately sprang to his eyes. "You know me. You know I'm a good cop. It was one bad call. Please don't do this here. You lost the right to call me by my first name the moment you put your hands on an innocent citizen," Hayes snapped, his jaw tight. "Turn around." Smith slowly turned, his shoulders shaking. Sergeant Riley stepped forward. Riley, the man who had been sweating bullets behind the booking desk just days prior, now unclipped a pair of standard-issue steel handcuffs from his own belt. "Hands behind your back," Riley ordered. As the cold steel clicked around his wrists, ratcheting tight and biting into his skin, Smith felt a violent wave of nausea wash over him. It was the exact same physical sensation he had inflicted upon Clement Pendleton. But the psychological reality was vastly, devastatingly different. Pendleton had known he was right. He had stood tall in his absolute innocence. Smith was drowning in the undeniable, suffocating reality of his own guilt. Riley didn't use a pain compliance technique. He didn't slam Smith against the doorframe to assert dominance. He simply grasped him by the bicep and guided him down the front steps toward the waiting cruiser. But as Smith was walked down his own driveway, his neighbors, the very people he had sworn to protect, the people he waved to on his morning jogs, were standing on their lawns, watching in absolute silence. Some held up their phones, recording the disgraced officer's perp walk. Smith was placed in the back of the cruiser. The hard plastic seat was unforgiving. The protective wire cage separating him from the front seats felt incredibly claustrophobic. As the cruiser pulled away, heading toward the county jail, Smith finally broke. He wept, the hot, pathetic tears of a bully who had finally encountered a system he could not intimidate. The booking process at the county jail was mercilessly standard. No professional courtesies were extended. No favors were called in. Smith was thoroughly searched, fingerprinted, photographed under harsh fluorescent lights, and stripped of his civilian clothes. He was handed an oversized, scratchy orange jumpsuit and a pair of flimsy foam sandals. As the heavy steel door of his holding cell slammed shut behind him, the finality of the sound echoed in his chest. He sat on the thin mattress, staring at the concrete wall. He had traded his career, his freedom, and his entire identity for 5 minutes of an ego trip. The avalanche of karma had finally hit the bottom of the valley, and Bradley Smith was buried completely underneath it. 6 months later, the media circus descended upon the federal courthouse in the heart of the city. United States versus Bradley Smith had become a landmark civil rights case. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was completely sterilized of emotion, governed entirely by the rigid protocols of the law. Judge Harrison Caldwell, a stern, deeply pragmatic jurist known for his zero-tolerance policy regarding public corruption, presided over the bench. Bradley Smith sat at the defense table. He looked entirely different from the swaggering, muscular officer who had stopped the midnight blue BMW. He had lost weight, his buzz cut had grown out into an unkempt mop, and his tailored suits hung loosely on his shrinking frame. Beside him sat a public defender. His union had completely drained his legal defense fund and abandoned him once the federal indictments dropped. At the prosecution table sat David Rosenberg, a razor-sharp federal prosecutor who viewed civil rights violations as a personal affront to the Constitution. The trial was a slaughter. Rosenberg didn't need witnesses to paint a picture. He had the ultimate, unblinking witness, the body camera footage. He played the tape for the jury in high definition. He paused it, frame by frame. He showed the dashboard camera footage of Pendleton's car, maintaining perfectly straight lines, proving the swerving justification was a total fabrication. He played the audio of the slur, letting the hateful word hang in the silent, vaulted courtroom. The defense's strategy was desperate. They tried to argue the split-second decision doctrine, claiming Smith believed he was in a high-stress, potentially dangerous situation. Rosenberg destroyed that defense in 3 sentences during his closing argument. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, a split-second decision applies to an officer facing down a drawn weapon in a dark alley. It does not apply to a sunny Saturday afternoon, trailing a compliant driver for 2 miles, inventing a traffic violation, and choosing to use a racial slur against a man whose only crime was asking for the legal justification of his detainment. Officer Smith wasn't policing his community. He was hunting for his ego. The federal jury deliberated for a mere 4 hours. When the 4-person stood to read the verdict, the courtroom held its breath. On the count of deprivation of rights under color of law, we find the defendant guilty. Smith slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. The gavel cracked, sharp and final. 2 weeks later, the courtroom reassembled for the sentencing phase. This was the moment that would define the rest of Smith's life. The federal sentencing guidelines for his crimes recommended a substantial term of imprisonment, but the judge had wide discretion. Before Judge Caldwell handed down the sentence, he asked if there were any victim impact statements. From the gallery, Clement Pendleton stood up. He was not wearing his judicial robes. He was dressed in a pristine, tailored navy suit, projecting an aura of immense, quiet dignity. He walked past the wooden swinging gate, stepped up to the podium, and adjusted the microphone. He did not look at the jury, and he did not look at the judge. He turned his head and looked directly at Bradley Smith. Smith couldn't meet his eyes. He stared at the polished mahogany table, his hands trembling. "Mr. Smith," Clement began, his voice the same rich, calm baritone that had infuriated Smith on the side of Elmwood Drive. "I want you to look at me." Slowly, agonizingly, Smith raised his head. The absolute fear in his eyes met the unwavering, cold judgment of the man he had abused. "When you pulled me over," Clement said, the silence in the room so profound you could hear a pin drop. "You did not see a citizen. You did not see a man. You saw a caricature built entirely from the darkest, most pathetic corners of your own prejudice. You wore a badge that represents the immense, sacred trust the public places in the state to hold the monopoly on violence, and you used that sacred trust to play the tyrant." Clement took a slow breath, his posture perfectly straight. "I did not announce my title to you that day, because justice should not be a privilege reserved for chief judges in luxury cars. Justice must be the baseline reality for the teenager walking home from the corner store, for the mechanic driving home from a third shift. When you placed those handcuffs on my wrists, you didn't just assault me. You assaulted the very foundation of the law I have sworn my life to protect. You are a coward, Mr. Smith. A coward who hid behind a piece of tin because he was terrified of a world he couldn't control." Clement held Smith's gaze for 5 more agonizing seconds. "I ask this court to impose the maximum sentence, not out of vengeance, but as a dire warning to any other officer who believes the Constitution stops where their fragile ego begins." Clement turned, nodded respectfully to Judge Caldwell, and walked back to his seat. Judge Caldwell adjusted his glasses and looked down at the disgraced officer. "Bradley Smith," Caldwell's voice boomed. "The court has heard the evidence, and the court has heard the victim. You have disgraced the uniform. You have weaponized your authority, and you have proven yourself entirely unfit to participate in a free society. It is the judgment of this court that you be committed to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons for a term of 48 months, to be followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are remanded into custody immediately." The U.S. Marshals stepped forward. They didn't ask Smith to turn around. They grabbed him roughly by the arms, hauled him to his feet, and snapped the heavy, chained federal cuffs onto his wrists. As Smith was marched out of the courtroom, headed for a federal penitentiary where former police officers are placed in protective custody, living 23 hours a day in isolation for their own safety, he cast one final look back at the gallery. Clement Pendleton was already turning away, putting his arm around his wife, Claire, preparing to go back to his life, his courtroom, and his weekend garden. Bradley Smith was completely, utterly erased from his concern. The catastrophic fallout of Bradley Smith's arrogance permanently altered the landscape of Oak Creek. Under the crushing weight of the federal consent decree, the police department was gutted and rebuilt. Corrupt union officials were ousted, aggressive use of force policies were rewritten, and mandatory, rigorous de-escalation training became the absolute standard. Bradley Smith traded his suburban patrol for a claustrophobic 8x10 concrete cell in a federal penitentiary, forever stripped of his pension, his voting rights, and his freedom. He became a textbook case study in police academies nationwide of how hubris violently destroys a career. Meanwhile, on a crisp Saturday morning exactly 1 year later, Chief Judge Clement Pendleton stood in his driveway in a faded sweatshirt. He climbed into his midnight blue BMW, rolled the windows down, and drove peacefully through the quiet streets, utterly unbothered, perfectly maintaining his lane.